It was just a restaurant photograph from 1923. 12 people gathered for a private dinner at a high society establishment in New York. Businessmen in dark suits, waitstaff arranged carefully along the edges, exactly the way formal photographs of that era were composed. For over a century, the photograph sat in a restaurant's donated archive collection, catalogued simply as Private Function, 1923. Nobody looked twice. Then in 2024, an archive intern in Manhattan zoomed in on one detail, and what she found is the exact reason you're watching this video right now. Her name was Julia Marsh, 23 years old, 3 weeks into a summer internship, digitizing a historical restaurant's donated photo collection. She'd scanned 9 images that morning. This was the 10th. A dinner party, elegant, composed, everyone facing the camera except one figure cropped almost entirely out of frame. A waitress, pressed into the far corner, face barely visible. Julia zoomed in on the waitress out of pure curiosity, wondering who'd been so carelessly excluded from her own photograph. Her hands stopped moving. Tucked into the waitress's apron pocket, just visible at the edge of the fabric, was the corner of a small folded notebook. Before you assume you already know where this story goes, you don't. Everything you're about to think happened next is wrong. And the real ending is not the one you're expecting. Julia had scanned dozens of restaurant staff photographs that summer. She had never seen a servant photographed with a personal notebook visible on her person. Not once. Not in any collection. Not in any era. This is not a story you've heard before. Historians who've since reviewed this case have said exactly the same thing, and by the end of this video, the answer will surprise you far more than the question does right now. Why would a waitress, invisible even in her own photograph, be carrying a private notebook into a room full of powerful men? And what did she write down that night that no one was ever meant to read? That question is what this story answers. But it does not end the way stories like this usually end. Stay until the final section, because what happens to the man responsible for all of it is not what you'll expect. Julia's supervisor, a restaurant historian named Dr. Franklin Reyes, agreed to examine the photograph the next morning. He recognized the setting immediately, a private dining room reserved, according to surviving reservation ledgers, for exactly one booking that entire month, November 14th, 1923. A dinner between an American industrialist named Charles Whitmore and a German investor, arranged to finalize what internal correspondence described as the largest transatlantic manufacturing agreement of the decade. Stay with this, because the deal that photograph was meant to celebrate never happened at all, and nobody, for 100 years, understood why. Dr. Reyes pulled Whitmore's business records, held in a regional historical society archive. The industrialist's company, a machine parts manufacturer with contracts across 3 states, collapsed within 18 months of that dinner. Historians studying Whitmore's downfall had always attributed it to poor post-war market timing, an explanation that appeared, on paper, entirely reasonable. It was also, as Dr. Reyes and Julia were about to discover, completely wrong. The waitress's name, buried in a staff payment ledger Julia found later that week, was Anneliese Voss. 22 years old, a German immigrant who had arrived in New York 6 years earlier with her family, fluent in both German and English, employed at the restaurant for less than a year. Nothing in her employment file suggested she was anything more than ordinary staff, reliable, punctual, unremarkable by every official measure the restaurant kept. But ordinary staff don't carry notebooks into private business dinners, and ordinary staff don't disappear from a photograph the way Anneliese Voss disappeared from history, deliberately cropped, deliberately forgotten, for reasons this video is about to make clear. Dr. Reyes made one more discovery before the day ended, one that would shape everything Julia researched afterward. The restaurant's reservation records listed a third guest at that dinner. Not a businessman, not a family member, but a professional translator, hired specifically to interpret between Whitmore and his German counterpart. His name was Gerald Finch. Remember that name. You will assume, for most of this story, that you already know how his part in it ends. You are wrong, and the truth is considerably more satisfying than anything you're picturing right now. Anneliese Voss had been raised in a household where 2 languages lived side by side. Her parents spoke German at home, English everywhere else, and by 14 she moved fluently between both without anyone in the family thinking much of it. Remember that detail. It is the entire reason this story exists, and the reason nobody at that dinner realized what was actually happening in front of them. By 1923, Anneliese worked 6 days a week, carrying trays, refilling glasses, staying invisible in the exact way the job required. She kept a small notebook in her apron, not for work but for herself, a habit from childhood, recording small observations, private thoughts, moments she wanted to remember. You're probably assuming that notebook is where this story turns emotional. It is, but not in the way you think. On the evening of November 14th, Annalise was assigned to the private dining room, an unremarkable assignment, given without explanation, simply because she happened to be the most experienced server available that night. She entered the room expecting nothing more than a long, quiet evening of pouring wine and clearing plates. Charles Whitmore sat across from a German investor named Klaus Bergman, with Gerald Finch positioned between them, translating each sentence as it passed from one man to the other. Here is where you're probably picturing a dramatic confrontation, a shouting match, an obvious villain. That is not what happened. What actually happened was quieter, and far more dangerous, because no one in that room could see it happening at all. Annalise moved through the room refilling glasses, half listening the way staff do, present but functionally invisible. Bergman spoke in German, describing manufacturing terms, contract percentages, delivery timelines. Finch translated each sentence into English for Whitmore, and here is the detail nobody in that room noticed except her. The English Finch spoke did not match the German Bergman had actually said. At first, Annalise assumed she'd misheard. She refilled another glass, listened more carefully, and confirmed it a second time. Small distortions, a percentage shifted slightly lower, a delivery deadline extended without mention, a phrase softened from firm to flexible. This is the moment you're expecting the story to become simple, a straightforward villain caught in a straightforward lie. It doesn't, because what Finch was doing was far more calculated than a single lie, and the reason behind it is not what you're picturing. Each individual distortion seemed small enough to be an honest translation error. Together, across a 2-hour negotiation, they added up to something else entirely, an agreement Whitmore believed he was signing that bore only a loose resemblance to the terms Bergman actually believed he was offering. Annalise kept pouring wine, and she kept counting. By the time dessert arrived, she had counted 11 distinct discrepancies between what was said and what was translated. 11. Not an accident, a pattern, and she was the only person in that entire room who could see it. She made a decision that evening that would define the rest of her life, one she recorded, in careful handwriting, in the small notebook tucked into her apron, the same notebook a young intern would zoom in on, 101 years later, and finally understand. Annalise approached Charles Whitmore near the end of the meal, while Bergman and Finch stepped briefly into the hallway. You're expecting this to be the moment everything changes. It is, but not for the reason you think, and not in Annalise's favor. She spoke quietly, quickly, aware she had only a narrow window before the men returned. She told him, plainly, that the translation didn't match what Bergman was actually saying, that the percentages were wrong, the deadlines had shifted, the terms he believed he was agreeing to were not the terms on the table. Whitmore looked at her, according to Annalise's own notebook entry, written that same night, the way a man looks at a chair that has spoken. This is the part of the story every viewer expects, the powerful man dismissing the invisible woman. You're right that it happened. You're wrong about what happens because of it, he told her, curtly, to return to her duties. A waitress, correcting a professional translator, on a deal worth more money than she would earn across 10 lifetimes. The idea was, to him, simply absurd. He never once considered that she might actually understand German better than the man he was paying to interpret it. Bergman and Finch returned. The dinner concluded. Documents were signed an hour later, in the next room, with Annalise nowhere near enough to see the final terms. Here is where the story could have simply ended, a warning ignored, an injustice unremarked, one more forgotten woman in one more forgotten photograph. But Annalise did something that changed everything, and it wasn't confrontation, it was patience. That night, after her shift ended, Annalise wrote everything down in careful, precise detail, every discrepancy she'd counted, the exact phrases Bergman used, the exact phrases Finch translated them into, times, as close as she could estimate them. Her own attempt, in the margins, to reconstruct what she believed the actual agreed terms should have been. She dated the entry. She signed her initials. And then, according to her own later writing, she did the only thing available to a woman with no power and no one willing to listen. She kept the notebook, and she waited. You're likely assuming the deal simply fell apart because Whitmore eventually discovered the fraud himself. That assumption is wrong, and the truth is stranger and considerably more satisfying than anything you're picturing right now. 18 months later, Whitmore's company collapsed. Historians researching his downfall, working only from surviving business correspondence, attributed it to post-war market conditions. A reasonable conclusion, given the records available to them, and completely incorrect. What actually destroyed Charles Whitmore's fortune was sitting, the entire time, in a small notebook tucked into an apron pocket, evidence of a fraud he'd been personally warned about and personally dismissed months before it ruined him. If a story like Annalise's, a woman who saw the truth clearly and was silenced simply for saying it out loud, deserves to be told properly, you know what to do. Dr. Reyes and Julia spent the following weeks tracing exactly what happened after that dinner, and what they found reframed the entire story. You are almost certainly assuming, right now, that Bergman eventually discovered Finch's fraud and confronted Whitmore directly. That is not what happened. What actually happened is far more ironic, and far more satisfying. Julia located Whitmore's surviving correspondence from the months following the dinner. The signed agreement, based on Finch's distorted translation, committed Whitmore's company to manufacturing terms significantly less favorable than what Bergman had genuinely offered, while simultaneously promising Bergman delivery timelines Whitmore's factories could never realistically meet. Both men, in other words, had signed a contract neither of them had actually agreed to. This is the detail that changes everything you thought you understood about Gerald Finch. He wasn't simply lying to help one side cheat the other, he was lying to both of them, for his own private financial gain. Dr. Reyes found the answer in a separate set of financial records. Gerald Finch's own private ledger, held in an unrelated estate archive donated decades later. Finch had quietly negotiated a personal finder's fee from a third party, a rival manufacturer eager to see the Whitmore-Bergman deal collapse entirely, clearing the field for their own competing contract. Finch distorted the translation just enough, on both sides, to guarantee the deal would eventually fall apart under its own contradictions, while collecting payment from the rival company the entire time, and collecting his standard translator's fee from Whitmore as well. He wasn't helping anyone. He was profiting from everyone. And the man he silenced in that dining room was the only person who saw it happening in real time. The deal collapsed exactly as Finch had engineered it to. Whitmore's company, bound to terms it couldn't fulfill, defaulted within 18 months. Bergman, believing Whitmore had negotiated in bad faith from the start, severed the business relationship entirely and warned other German investors away from Whitmore's name. Here is where most stories like this one end, with the injustice permanent, the fraud unpunished, the fortune gone forever. This story does not end there. Stay with it, because what happened to Gerald Finch next is the part audiences remember longest. Dr. Reyes found what he was looking for in a German business archive, cross-referenced against Finch's own ledger. A full year after the Whitmore deal collapsed, Finch was hired for a separate translation assignment, this time working directly for Klaus Bergman on an entirely unrelated contract. He tried the exact same fraud a second time, and this time it caught up with him completely. The second deal, in 1925, involved Bergman negotiating directly with a different American company, this time with Finch again serving as translator, hired specifically because Bergman still trusted him, entirely unaware of what had actually happened 18 months earlier. You are almost certainly expecting this story to end with quiet, symbolic justice. A man who got away with it, forgotten by history the way Annalise was forgotten. That is not how this ends. Stay with it, because the real ending is the part that makes this story worth telling at all. Finch attempted the same pattern of small, cumulative distortions, but this time, one of Bergman's own junior associates, bilingual, sharp, and specifically instructed by Bergman to monitor the negotiation closely after the earlier failed deal, caught the discrepancies within the first hour. The same fraud, the same method. Caught almost immediately this time, because Bergman had learned, from painful experience, not to fully trust a single translator's word again. Finch was confronted directly, in front of both parties, and the confrontation exposed not only the 1925 fraud, but triggered a formal review of his prior work, including eventually the 1923 Whitmore deal. This is the detail that changes everything. Gerald Finch's own greed, repeated a second time, is what finally exposed the truth Annalise had tried to tell everyone 18 months earlier, and nobody had believed. Bergman's legal team, reviewing Finch's translation history as part of the fraud investigation, requested copies of every contract Finch had worked on over the previous 5 years. It was routine due diligence, the kind lawyers perform automatically once fraud is confirmed once. What they found buried in those older files is the piece of evidence that finally connected everything back to that November evening in 1923. Finch's own private ledger, the same one Dr. Reyes had located decades later in an unrelated estate archive, surfaced briefly during the 1925 investigation itself, subpoenaed, reviewed, and then, as legal records from the period show, quietly filed away, once the immediate case against him was settled out of court. Nobody in 1925 connected Finch's fraud back to Whitmore's ruined company. Whitmore was already gone by then. His name meant nothing to lawyers focused only on Bergman's current losses. The 1923 deal, and the waitress who'd tried to warn him, simply weren't part of anyone's investigation. Finch's professional reputation collapsed within months regardless. Translation work in high-stakes business negotiations depended entirely on trust, and word of the exposed 1925 fraud spread quickly through the small, tightly connected world of international business interpreters. No firm would hire him again. No investor would sign a contract he'd translated. He built his entire scheme on the assumption that no one would ever check closely enough to catch him. He was right, for exactly one deal. On the second attempt, that assumption finally failed him, the same way it had failed Anneliese Voss to assume, correctly, that no one would listen to her the first time. Dr. Reyes found Finch's own final entry in his private ledger, dated December 1925, unusually reflective for a man otherwise focused entirely on numbers. It read simply, "Twice was one time too many. I forgot that greed leaves a paper trail, even when words do not." The man who silenced a waitress because he believed no one would ever listen to her was undone by the exact same lie, told one time too many, to people who finally did listen, though even then, not for her sake, and not because anyone remembered her name. Dr. Reyes and Julia continued researching for months afterward, trying to understand what became of Anneliese herself, and whether anyone, in her own lifetime, ever learned she had been right. You might be expecting this story to end with Anneliese finally getting her moment of public vindication while she was still alive to see it. It doesn't. And that absence is exactly why this story matters as much as it does. They found no evidence she was ever formally credited or thanked. Anneliese continued working as a waitress for several more years after that November evening, married a fellow German immigrant named Otto Hartmann in 1927, and by every surviving record, never spoke publicly about the 1923 dinner again. Her notebook, according to a brief mention in a later family letter Julia eventually located, was kept in a small wooden box for the rest of her life. Not discussed, not displayed, simply kept, the way people keep proof of something they were never allowed to say out loud. She never received an apology. She never received credit. The only record of what she'd seen, and what she'd tried to warn a powerful man about, remained folded inside an apron pocket, then a wooden box, for over a century, until a photograph nobody had looked at closely finally gave her back her voice. The story became public in early 2025, published jointly by Dr. Reyes and Julia through a regional business history journal, alongside high-resolution scans of Anneliese's original notebook pages. Weeks later, a man named Robert Whitmore, Charles Whitmore's great-grandson, contacted Julia directly. "My family always called it bad business," he wrote. "A deal that fell apart, a fortune that never came back, nobody's fault in particular. We never knew someone had actually tried to warn him. We never knew her name. This is the moment the story stops being only about the past, and starts being about what the people left behind choose to do with the truth, once they finally have it." Robert traveled to New York that spring and met with Anneliese's living descendants, a great-niece named Karen Voss, who had grown up hearing only a vague family story about Aunt Anneliese and her notebook, never fully understood. Karen brought the original wooden box to that first meeting. Inside, alongside the notebook itself, was a single line Anneliese had written on the box's inner lid, dated many years after the dinner, in handwriting noticeably older and steadier than her 1923 entries. "I was right, and it did not matter. I am writing this anyway, because someday, being right might matter to someone else." That line is the reason this entire story exists, written by a woman who never expected to be believed, for an audience she never expected to have. Together, Robert and Karen stood in front of the restored photograph, now displayed with a small plaque bearing Anneliese's full name for the first time in over a century. "She saw the truth when it mattered most," Robert said, at the small unveiling that followed, "and she was ignored because of who she was, not because of what she knew. We can't undo that. But we can finally say her name. Look at the photograph one final time. A waitress, cropped into the corner, barely visible, exactly the way the room chose to see her that night. She is not the forgotten figure this story once made her out to be. She was the only person in that entire room who understood exactly what was happening, and the only one brave enough to say so, even after she was told it didn't matter. What would you have done, in her position, certain of the truth, and certain that no one with power would ever choose to hear it, if stories like Anneliese's, the ones history tried hardest to silence, deserve to be found and told properly? Subscribe, and let's keep listening to the voices we were never meant to hear.